Chapter 48. Aemond the Squire? Aemond. Sir Harold had some audacity. The tasks he set his new squire to were impertinent, but regardless, Aemond put on a brave face and begrudgingly trotted down to the king's stable to feed Sir Harold's 4 horses. It's not as if he hadn't done the same during hunts in the Kingswood, and Aemond already happened to own 7 horses of his own too. Afterwards, Aemond had grumbled when he was made to saddle Knight. The black horse's full name was Nightmare, and she acted as such when a stranger came to saddle her. But this was yet another task Aemond had done countless times before. He joined the Lord Commander for a ride through the city afterwards, which had been fine, but it was this latest meaningless task where Aemond had to put his foot down. Certainly, Aemond may be Sir Harold's squire, but the last he checked he remained a prince too. Princes did not sit for hours cleaning chainmail. How is this task pertinent to becoming a knight? Aemond asked, exasperated. This is servant's work. Since Aemond had made enough of a fuss regarding his betrothal, he couldn't turn down the squireship too. Not that it had been an option after his king father was informed of it. If Aemond backed out now, the court may think it was because he couldn't handle it. There was no way but through. Aemond would be a knight, even though he had to overcome some nasty challenges before he got there. Sir Harold made Aemond spend his first day as a squire going over the basics. First looking after horses and then familiarizing himself with the ins and outs of the Kingsguard armor. Except, Aemond already knew. He'd had an armor of his own for years. A fine thing Aemond inherited from Aegon after he outgrew it. The blackened armor was decorated with the Targaryen emblem and rubies, though sized for a boy. When Aemond last tried his armor nearly a year ago, the chest plate had been too short for him, and he'd grown taller since. Likely Daeron would inherit it next. It may fit Rhaenyra's sons too, but there was no way they'd receive it. The armor was emblazed with the Targaryen sigil, and even if they were his nephews, bastards pretending to be Velaryons had no business wearing it. For as long as Lord Corlys played along with Rhaenyra's lies, it left the task of armoring her bastards to House Velaryon. Knights need know how to care for their armor, lad, Sir Harold answered, unfazed. My previous squires upheld my maintenance for me. They were not your prince, Aemond reminded him, irate that the old knight appeared nearly amused by his suffering. Squiring was turning into a tedious affair, and Sir Harold's style of tutelage left a lot to be desired. Besides, Aemond genuinely wished Sir Criston had been available for this instead. Sir Harold may be the Lord Commander, but Sir Criston remained the best swordsman of the Kingsguard. Unfortunately, Sir Criston already had a squire, and his grandfather thought having Aemond squire for the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard looked better than doing so for the underlings. It's true that I've never been outranked by my squire before, Sir Harold answered. But they all became knights in time, which you are not. Knights are the men capable of protecting the weak and the young. Sword fighting and riding is integral to knighthood. Aemond waved the mail in the air, the little ringlets clattering against each other. But how is this pertinent to anything? Sir Harold sighed. I already know you are apt with swords and horses. It's everything else you need to familiarize yourself with. Tell me, do you know the difference between a knight with a student to teach compared to a knight with a squire? Aemond didn't know exactly what Sir Harold was about to preach, but he gathered the old Western knight wasn't being agreeable. If Sir Harold would ignore Aemond's argument for his lofty excuses, then he was inclined to ignore whatever the knight spewed next as well. Taking on a lord's son as a student is for their convenience, but a squire serves for my convenience. I'm here to teach you my ways, but in return I expect you to be here for me. If you fulfill your role as my squire, I will reward it with knighthood, Sir Harold explained, and gestured to the ringlet garment Aemond was waving about. When I say my mail is muddy and needs to be cleaned, I expect you to be as good a squire as you've been a student in the art of swords. It's a necessary task which I don't trust to anyone but those who understand the workings of an armor. If you do a poor job of it and the mail rusts, I may die in battle because of poor armor. Then what sort of squire would you be? Sir Harold said it like a challenge, but Aemond had partly stopped listening. Why was he bothering with this nonsense? When he'd been young and naive, he dreamt of becoming a knight. What lad in King's Landing did not? Aemond had wanted to be a fierce warrior, a great knight, wise, studied, and a dragon rider. The perfect prince. At some point, perhaps it had been around the time Daeron was offered a squireship by their Hightower relatives, the notion of knighthood stopped being a priority. If little snotty boys like Daeron showed potential ahead of Aemond, then why should he bother? Aemond told himself what mattered was to get a dragon, not some knighthood. What could steel hope to achieve against wings and fire? That was years ago, and Aemond was no longer that naive lad. He was almost a man grown, with the steadfast loyalty of the Bronze Fury, a dragon worthy of kings. And, after Aegon's crippling, at long last his Hightower relative showed an interest in making him a knight too. It didn't take a great mind to put 2 and 2 together. It was to prove that even if Aegon was down, the king's younger sons weren't all crippled, that they had strength, that they were not only worthy by birth and blood, but capability too. It was ironic how the sudden show of interest in his accomplishments made Aemond's previous efforts seem uselessly futile. What had it all been for? Aemond had tried his best for years, but it hadn't mattered. Regardless of how hard he studied, how long he trained, or how dutifully he conducted himself, it wouldn't grant him anything more than he was already born into. It didn't close the gap between him and Aegon, not between him and Rhaenyra either. In the end, it turned out what furthered Aemond's standing wasn't improving himself. No, only the competition being weakened could further his own standing. So why should Aemond try? Either his siblings would get everything regardless of Aemond's accomplishments, or they'd suffer an unfortunate end. Whatever Aemond received wouldn't be by his own efforts, only their crippling. Aegon and Rhaenyra were walking disasters who needed constant hand-holding to get anything done. And even then they managed to make a mess of everything. Of the few duties they'd been tasked with throughout their lives, both had failed them. They'd been tasked to do the bare minimum, but even that was beyond them. Aegon couldn't do the measly task of staying healthy and look presentable. Rhaenyra couldn't do the one duty nearly every other woman in Westeros had managed for thousands of years: to birth true-born children. Yet despite being such embarrassment to their house, they didn't change anything. Neither effort nor capability mattered, only birth. Either it was being born with Arryn blood like Rhaenyra, or being born the first son like Aegon. And strictly speaking, wasn't that their respective mothers' accomplishments? Queen Aemma and Queen Alicent were the two who managed those things. It had absolutely nothing to do with their firstborn children's capability, which remained somewhere around non-existent. Begging the question, why did Aemond keep beating a dead horse? The only part of Aemond's life where efforts made a difference was with Vermithor and with Herial. Perhaps this was why Aemond found magic more richly palatable compared to the sweet reek of politics. So sweet it was sickly. Though it was somewhat ironic how the mystical art seemed a more controllable power than the Game of Thrones. Sir Harold took his thoughtful silence for agreement, instead of the depressing spiral of meaningless futility Aemond was contemplating. Now be thorough with the scrubbing. You may think it's clean, only to find grime hiding in the gap where the joints overlap. That's where it'll rust and tears over time. He patted Aemond patronizingly on the back, as if that little speech had settled the matter. Aemond rolled back his shoulders, readying a word lashing which would leave the court ladies a-twittering with the juicy drama. Unfortunately, Sir Harold's good-humoured patience had a short fuse, and since the Kingsguard couldn't reprimand a prince, he dragged Aemond along to someone who could. Still, Aemond couldn't believe Sir Harold would tell to his king father. "What's this about?" the king asked, seated by his model of old Valyria. He was wrapped in a thick Shadowcat's coat, with woolen blankets draped across his lap, even though the chambers were well heated by the warmth of 2 fireplaces in the king's apartments. "Your son takes offense to the task I assigned him, your grace." For the 100th time, Eamon wished Sir Kristen had been available. I am not your whipping boy. I treat him no different than my previous squires, but the lad is right that I can't command him to clean my chainmail. He is my prince. Did you not become a squire but recently? The king wondered. Today's Prince Aemon's first day, your grace. And there's already an issue? His father looked sideways to Aemon. Are you conceding the challenge, lad? Pardon, but I feel as if conceding a position and speaking up about an infringement is the same thing, your grace. Aemon said stiffly. I am not a servant. Being Sir Harold's squire shouldn't make me have to pretend I'm a stable boy. Sir Harold pursed his lips. How would you like the squiring to proceed, my king? This is about cleaning chainmail? His father glanced at Aemon, seeming slightly bewildered why on earth he was involved with this. Aemon wished Sir Harold had gone to his mother, or grandfather. Everyone else in this castle except his father would do the right thing here. You accepted the position, and this sounds perfectly in line with the duty of a squire. Except it wasn't. Not for princes. Not even all lords were made to jump through such hoops. Sir Lenor never squired before his knighting. He'd been to war, and upon Sir Lenor's return he was betrothed to Rhaenyra. He'd then been knighted because it looked more proper for the future king consort to be a knight. Daemon had never squired before being knighted, and there were plenty of examples of good swordsmen being knighted without squiring beforehand. Aemon was no lesser than them. He understood his age still worked against him. There had never been a knight who was 4 and 10, so being a squire remained a suitable title. Yet Aemon wouldn't be made to lower himself. Then think of it like this. From time to time, we must all be burdened with tasks we would rather do without. But it's a necessity, and worth an effort in pursuit of our goals. His father said, turning around the stone figure in his hand. This is part of growing up and becoming a man. How many chainmails were you set to clean by your father before Prince Balon considered you a man grown, my king? Sir Harold glanced at Aemon sharply, and his king father blinked. Even before his king answered, Aemon would bet all 7 of his horses the answer was 0. I was the heir to the throne, not a warrior. My obstacles were different to yours. Aemon pressed his lips together, looking away as he wondered exactly what charges his king father had been faced with, except to stay alive long enough to be crowned. Then how many chainmail did the rogue prince scrub before he was knighted? Daemon was always an excellent swordsman, born to be a warrior, and he was knighted after a tourney when he was only 6 and 10. The king's voice grew warm and wistful, reminiscing about a long-ago tourney. Everyone was awed by him. We'd watched Daemon horse 3 nights in a row. Our father was so proud when the Lord Commander at the time, Sir Ryan Redwine, knighted Daemon before the masses. It was a grand day indeed. Aemon had arrived to this conversation prepared to argue stale advice and lofty excuses, but not his father gushing about how amazing his insane little brother was half an eternity ago. Give me that, Aemon said tightly, snapping the chainmail out of Sir Harold's hand. I don't have time for this farce. If the king is of a mind to say scrubbing mail like a smith's apprentice is a rite of passage, I'll do the fucking task. There you go, the matter is resolved then. His king father turned back to his model, but looked sharply back, seeming to remember something urgent. Wait, before you leave, I have a matter that needs sorted out. I hear Lady Harriel is visiting the Red Keep. Please do send for her, he said, nodding to himself. A few moons ago she used her magic on my model of Old Valyria, and it was marvelous. He gestured over his stone model. Aemon remembered what Harriel had done to it. There had been lights inside the buildings, water in the rivers, grass and cobblestone along the streets. He thought perhaps the stone staircases had some lingering magic to them, but it may be a trick of the uneven light. though talking of his toys coming to life with magic had Viserys' eyes light up with excitement. I'm afraid my model looks rather drab now, compared to when my miniature dragon could fly around the model and the fires crackled inside the buildings. It's Maiden's Day, my king, Sir Harold reminded him. The girls are in the sept. Ah. The king nodded, a crease of worry on his brow. The threat of his toys being made to wait far more concerning to the king than anything discussed until now. She'll be purifying herself then. But surely that shouldn't take the whole day, and her magic casting didn't take long either. Lady Harold can stop by in between sermons. The girls should have time after their noon sermon, Aemon said. Regardless of how irate he was, the king seemed to like Aemon's betrothed. He already knew the king did to some extent, but it was encouraging to see it nonetheless. If it pleases you, I could send her to enchant your model instead, your grace, Aemon offered. Aye. He nodded eagerly. Thank you, Daemon. Aemon. His king father had the frustrating grace to look blankly back. The affectionate tone he talked of his Valyria model falling away. My name is Aemon. Something akin to resentment simmered in the undertone of the correction. Aemon didn't bother the king with his presence often, but the few times he did, was it too much to ask the king to remember the name he had given him? His king father picked up his figurine dragon with a sigh and turned back to play with his model. I'm aware. The day had passed in an agitated blur, and Aemon wasn't dismissed before Sir Harold's evening shift started. Free of the torture, Aemon made a sacred vow. Never again. Never, ever again. The king would have to whip him before he was made to do such demeaning servant's work again. Throwing Sir Harold's scrub chainmail onto the table, a fuming Aemon retired to his rooms and ordered a private supper. His chamber smelled tantalizing of honeyed goose with carrots, cabbage and leeks cooked with butter, when Sir Fish Crab, the commander of the City Watch, was led inside to join him for the meal. Of course, this was not a social visit. We captured 4 men and brought them to the cells. Afterwards, one of my men swore that he recognized one of the prisoners. He was certain he'd imprisoned one of the men before, though it was years ago. Commander Fish Crab explained, absently working to separate the meat of the bone with a knife. Aemon wished he hadn't invited the man that morning. He would give anything for some privacy. To sit before the fireplace and read, or maybe send for the court minstrel to play some music. But how could he have predicted the abuse Sir Harold would put him through earlier? We looked into the matter, and found that all 4 of them had been caught and imprisoned before, 4 years ago. What for? Aemon asked, chewing down a mouthful of carrots and cabbage. It was a deviant, a couple of traitors, and a murderer. The 4 were sentenced to death for their crimes, my prince. Aemon blinked. But they escaped? How come I don't recall the security breach? It was a while ago, but not so long I wasn't paying attention. Where he offered to go to the wall, but escaped on the route there. No, my prince, it wasn't an escape. I couldn't say if they'd been offered the wall or not, but it didn't come to a sentence before they were pardoned and set free. That was the last Aemon wanted to hear. On what grounds? It was part of the celebrations of the newborn Prince Joffrey. The king decreed several prisoners to be offered mercy. Fantastic. Yet another clue for the collection that pointed them out as involved with this mess. Not all royal births granted prisoners mercy. If the season allowed for it, sometimes they held a tourney or other festivities instead. But sometimes new life made for soft hearts, and thereby mercy. There'd been a tourney for Aegon, but Aemon had heard a few deviants had gone free after his own birth, as well as Helena's. Though which criminals were offered mercy was usually more carefully selected than this. Some starving lad excused for stealing from the king after being caught hunting in the king's wood without a permit, or a widow with a horde of hungry children pardoned for stealing. People who committed crimes but who also had somewhat of an excuse which could be forgiven. Sir Harmon Strong, he was still the commander of the City Watch back then, released them, He oversaw this, but then he was dismissed from his duty before burning to death at Harrenhal. It's not as if we can ask him. Sir Fish Crab may have been friends with the treacherous knight once upon a time. The one who shamelessly fucked his sworn charge, dishonored a princess, shamed his house as he committed high treason siring those usurpers, deluding himself that as long as the king stuffed his ears with straw pretending it wasn't happening, it meant everyone else did the same. He'd been a treacherous lackwit, and Aemon chose not to dwell on the topic of the dead strong. Aloud. As far as Aemon could see, Harwin got what he deserved. If even one of his crimes had been proven sooner, Sir Harwin would have lost his head before his first bastard Jacaerys was born, or at the very least sent to the wall like Lucamore Strong, saving House Targaryen being besmirched with the younger two alongside his sister's dim-witted treason. Safe to say, Aemon was not surprised to learn Sir Harwin was connected to yet another disaster. Another matter that made a joke of the monarchy and left the king looking utterly incompetent. Unable to keep order in either his family or his castle. Aemon took a sip of his water. Mercy releases are for petty crimes, not murder. The murderer choked a whore to death whilst drunk, Fish Crab said with a shrug. His tongue was removed as punishment. Why not take the hand that killed the whore or gelled him? Such is the fitting punishment, more so than having his tongue removed. It's not our place to question the king's command, said Fischette, only to see them fulfilled. So it is. Aemon leant back in his seat, his fingers tracing the snarling dragon carvings on the wooden armrest. That was years ago, though. It seems they took their freedom and squandered it. What have you learned now? They can't speak, said Fischette, shrugging. There's only so much Lord Larys can get out of illiterate men without tongues. But rest assured, he's not going easy on them, my prince. What of their home? Did you learn what they were doing with that building? There were human remains stored in the boxes. It's hard to say for certain when the culprits can't explain their madness. Personally, my guess is cheap meat. Aemon stared at him blankly. They probably intended to sell it to the pot shops in Fleabottom, for the bowels of Brown. I don't follow, Sir Fish. When the winter bite sets into the air, the animals hibernate and the crops don't grow. Whatever food remains available is scarce and costly, so the small folk must get creative. In Fleabottom, there are these huge tubs in the pot shops that has been boiling stew for years, which the poorest can resort to. If a peasant brings in their own dead rat or pigeon, they'll cook it up for them in the stew. Granted, they skin it themselves first. That's only enough for one portion though. A hunter, fisherman or farmer can come in and hand over their goat, hare, fish or a kill from a hunt, and that way earn a bit of profit. The pot shops are never picky about what sort of meats are brought in. As long as it's filling, it'll do. Sir Fish looked at him meaningfully. Any meat will do. Any meat? Anything at all. As long as the meat is fresh-ish and without bones, the price they get for it is slightly better than when someone shows up with a carcass, which looks like what those criminals were up to when we apprehended them. The remains stored in the house was cut to carryable chunks and most were cleaned of bones. Had we come a little later, it'll probably have been gone. Small folk are selling human corpses to the pot shops that's cut to pieces, cooked and then served to the Fleabottom beggars in their bowls of brown, Aemon clarified. So the rumors claim. These rumors, do you believe them true? Sir Fish seemed to hesitate and then shrugged. If they're eating dead citizens, it'd be illegal. It was a non-answer, though basically akin to a confirmation. If the commander of the City Watch knew for certain, he'd have no choice but to shut it down. But one way or another, people had to eat. With the wrong sort of attention on the pot shops in Fleabottom, it'd leave the small folk going even more hungry. There'd be more unrest, more crime, and more work for the man tasked to keep the peace within the King's City. Whose body parts were they selling? Aemond asked. Who could say? Mayhaps it was some orphan kid no one would miss. A drunk whore. Someone they needed to disappear forever. Or perhaps they came across a corpse that froze to death overnight and were being opportunistic. It was impossible to tell. Hadn't there been a whole ear in there, it'd be hard to identify as human remains to begin with. What of your missing guard? Could it have been him? As I said, it was impossible to tell. Mayhaps Lord Larys will learn more. Aemond's eyes trailed over the fireplace while slowly contemplating everything, from the secret ingredients in the bowls of brown, to what trick Larys Strong might implement that could make 4 mutes able to talk. It didn't seem possible, but he'd been the Lord Confessor for a very, very long time. Longer than Aemond had been alive. Once upon a time, Larys' father, Lord Lionel Strong, had served as the Master of Law. Hadn't it therefore been a neat arrangement that if someone broke the law in King's Landing, then his son and heir Harwin Strong was tasked to catch the criminals through his duties in the City Watch? Of course, answering for their crimes would only occur if anyone except Harwin himself broke the law, whilst the rest were handed off to his crippled little brother Larys to be questioned and tortured. The Strongs had been an efficient team in some regard, and absolutely corrupt in others, hiding their treasons underneath cloaks of righteousness, and bending the law so it didn't apply to themselves. They preached duty and honor, whilst punishing men for far lesser atrocities than what they themselves were committing. Aemond wasn't sure how involved Lionel was with Harwin's treasons on a day-to-day basis. He only knew that for a decade straight, the father used every ounce of his influence as Master of Law, and then later as Hand of the King, to protect his eldest from facing consequences for Harwin's unfortunate inability to stop fucking a married princess. It was only Lord Lionel's favour with the king that allowed a dunderhead like Harwin to rise to commander of the City Watch to begin with, and Harwin saw fit to take all of these royal honours and to break every single oath he'd ever made. Breaking the one he'd made as a knight to govern the king's peace, the one made as the commander of the City Watch to uphold the law, and the one made to the king in a ceremony to protect his sworn charge. The king had trusted Sir Harwin Strong with the duty to govern his heir, not to rape her, or fuck her, or whatever Aemond was supposed to call their poorly hidden dalliance. If Aemond ever had a daughter, he'd never assign her a sworn protector and then leave them alone. It was a pity that women couldn't be knights, or such issues would have an easy solution. In the end, burning to death was a punishment befitting of their crimes. The two Strongs had taken advantage of the king's generosity and deceived House Targaryen and the Kingdom of Westeros, and likely felt smug about getting away with it. Lord Lionel plotted to have his bastard grandson be the future king, and his other bastard grandson would supplant House Velaryon and become the richest man in Westeros, whilst Harwin remained untouchable whilst his father cleaned up his careless messes. They'd return to Harrenhal where they'd assumed they'd be safest, only to end up screaming in flames. The same fate that befell all those idiotic enough to cross the House of the Dragons. 2 of the 3 Strongs were dead now, but the youngest remained. Perhaps I should have a word with Lord Strong, Aemond mused. Larys' loyalties were hard to place. He couldn't quite place Larys in the same treasonous boat as his closest kin, as there was little proof he'd been involved. But Aemond refused to believe Larys hadn't known what his family was doing. He'd known, but hadn't said anything. And after that, Aemond wasn't able to trust him further than he could keep an eye on him. Unlike his mother, who for some unfathomable reason held him in confidence. Yet with Larys' occupation as the royal torturer and his dishonorable lineage, the man reeked of traitors. Though did that mean he couldn't be of use? Aemond had to give him some credit. Larys had always treated his nephews with disdain. As the Lord Confessor, Larys might have been the one who cut their tongues out. Ironic, really. Had he simply stuck to gelding or cutting off a limb 4 years ago, he wouldn't have made his own job that much harder. Their supper was interrupted by his valet, Romeo, arriving at Aemond's door to notify him of a matter that needed his immediate attention. Would it never stop? The man pushed his wet hair out of his eyes and said frazzled, "I apologize for inconveniencing you, my prince. It's regarding Lady Hariel." What's the matter? With a strained expression, Romeo shifted his grip on the door handle. This will sound peculiar, but I swear, I went to send Lady Herald to the King's Solar as you requested, but it's raining in the hallway outside her chamber, my prince. Eamon squinted towards the darkening window, but there was no rain, no snow either. I see no rain. The weather has cleared since this morning, Romeo. I don't mean... It's raining inside, my prince. Inside the hallway. Some sort of magic and no one can get through the door. Ariel's chamber was on the 4th floor, where guests of honor were usually given rooms when they visited the capital. On his way there, Eamon had to bypass a gaggle of noisy white-dressed ladies who'd been sent away by Sir Eric. He saw Lady Grace Wild in the center of the group whispering something to Bela. Though regardless of who they were or whom they'd married, they'd all be refused further access by the doorway to the 4th floor. But such didn't stop a prince. This was his home, and the King's Guard allowed Eamon through with no further protest than a wry expression. Romeo had spoken true. It was an absurd sight. The hallway flooded because of a grey rain cloud hovering underneath the ceiling. Sir Eric had taken charge of the chaos by making sure the other chambers connected to that hallway had been emptied, and the occupants sent elsewhere where the magical deluge couldn't reach. Fascinated by the impossibility, Eamon took a moment to stare. There was a rain cloud inside the Red Keep. The only ones left were a handful of guards, servants, a prince, and a dwarven court fool, who came gleefully skipping through a doorway, kicking up water with his stubby legs. Mushroom, Sir Eric yelled. I told you everyone were to leave. The fool obeyed, even if he complied reluctantly slowly. Yet under Sir Eric's sharp glare, Mushroom eventually waddled back up the hallway and through the door to the staircase. Oh, what are we to do? Nothing we've tried so far has made a difference, Romeo fretted. How are we to make it stop? And what if it gets worse? Will the whole castle be flooded? Eamon went over to Ariel's door, curious how this had happened, but not nearly as worried as his valet. Not until Eamon realized it was more than the hallway that was under an enchantment. When he tried to open it, Ariel's door didn't budge, which was peculiar when the door didn't have a lock. It could not have been barred from the inside by pushing a dresser or the bed in front of the entrance either, seeing as the door was supposed to swing outwards. Eamon was getting drenched by the rain as he hammered on the door and demanded Ariel open it, but without luck. Why didn't she answer? Why would you leave him out here in the rain? Are you positive she's inside? Eamon asked Romeo. Quite certain. It wasn't like Ariel to not respond when her door was being pounded. Even if they'd been arguing, which they were not the last time Eamon checked, at least she'd acknowledge his presence by yelling at him to go away. Yet now there was nothing. How could Ariel not hear him? Could she be hurt? Eamon looked to the door next to Ariel's. It was another chamber left unoccupied since Aegon's disaster of a wedding ended and the guests left. We must find another way in. He eyed the other door speculatively. Could someone go through the window in that room and climb from there over to Ariel's window along the outer wall? That's drastic, Romeo worried. They may fall to their death, my prince. We have to get inside somehow, Eamon stated. It's not like he could fly Vermivore that close to the facade without his dragon knocking his massive wings into everything, likely tearing apart the building before Eamon ever got inside a window. What if the shutters are on? They won't be able to break open the planks without holding on for dear life to the wall too. Fine. Do we have a ladder tall enough to reach her window? Climbing up the facade from the courtyard to Ariel's window would cause a stir. Until now they'd gotten away with barring the doors and sending people away, but the whole castle would be able to watch that stunt. It's the 4th floor, Romeo said thoughtfully. But perhaps it could be done. There may be another way in, my prince, said Sir Eric. Eamon turned to the King's Guards. I may be able to get inside Lady Ariel's chamber through a servant passage. There are several in this part of the castle. There were numerous secret passages sprawling across the Red Keep. Everyone knew at least one, but none knew them all. And it was true there were especially many around the rooms designated for guests of honor. When Maegor oversaw the construction of the Red Keep, he'd certainly shown zero trust for any visitor or respect for their privacy. Yet Aemon didn't know of one that went directly into Hariel's chamber. That was part of why he'd assigned her that chamber for her stay. You know of a passage into Hariel's chamber? Not hers per se, but I know how to get into the one 3 doors down. That's of little aid. Aemon glanced dismissively at the open doors down the hall. We can already get in there. That's the one I know how to access, but I suspect there's other passages that I don't know how to get into. One might lead to Lady Hariel's room. If such a passage exists in the first place, I might know whom to ask to get into it. It was worth a try. Then do so. Aemon nodded. While Sir Eric went to find out about the passages, Aemon remained in the corridor. Romeo fetched Aemon's cloak and a parasol to fend off the rain. It wasn't truly a hard downpour, more akin to misty raindrops that fell light yet steady from the foggy clouds, but the water pooled up over time in the enclosed space of the hallway. By the time Sir Eric returned, the servants had brought up rolled up rugs and used them as a dam to prevent the water getting into the staircase, and dozens of buckets were placed through the corridor to catch the rain. Pardon, but I brought a rat catcher, Prince Aemon, Sir Eric said, gesturing to the small man behind him. This is cheese. A rat catcher. It's a good idea. They know the secret passages well, my prince, Romeo advised. The passages are well used by the rats, and the catchers follow. Small of stature and ragged, he was just the sort expected to be found in the walls of the Red Keep. With a curt nod, Aemon allowed Sir Eric to execute his idea. This is the door we need to get into, Sir Eric told the rat catcher, pointing out Hariel's door. Is there a passage in? His eyes darted nervously around, briefly to the door, up to the walls, and down to the floor. Anywhere but his prince. If you can get me inside, there'll be a silver moon waiting for you, rat catcher, Aemon offered impatiently. You intend to go, my prince? Romeo protested. Sir Eric frowned. You need not worry yourself, my prince. I will go and sort it out. She's my betrothed. You may accompany me, Sir Eric, but I'm going too. The rat catcher's pale green eyes darted towards Aemon, before his gaze subserviently dropped to his feet. Though with the promise of a reward, the man gave a quick, wordless nod. Can you get us into that chamber? Sir Eric pressed. With a downcast gaze, the man smiled in a way that brought out a sudden physical similarity to the creatures he caught for a living. Aye, where there's a rat, there's a way. To get into the right passage, they had to backtrack to the opposite end of the floor below, to a modest, windowless chamber where the Maester's assistant lived. The assistant was confused when they entered his room, looking up from where he was buried in books about loss of limbs, and growing more bewildered when an entrance to a secret passage was located directly underneath the man's bed. What? The apprentice exclaimed when the rat catcher pulled his bed aside to reveal the trapdoor underneath it. I didn't know that was there. Sir Eric was made to remove his bulky armor and white cloak, which would otherwise get in the way. Ready to go, the rat catcher climbed down, followed by Sir Eric and Aemon. The secret passage wasn't one of the comfortable ones to traverse. Narrow and cramped, it was probably as bad as the one Aemon had found with Hariel that led to the small council room. He also missed the convenience of Hariel's light spells, because the lantern in Sir Eric's hand was far inferior to fight darkness. Following the rat catcher, Aemon and Eric walked stooped until they reached what seemed like a dead end. Except the rat catcher started climbing the end wall. Using a few strategically missing bricks as footholds, they climbed up, and the next stretch of path, if one could call it that, was traversed on all fours. They crawled over cobwebs and dust, and it got worse when water began leaking through the ceiling. A good indication though that they were crawling directly underneath the flooded hallway. Ugh. Aemon shuddered as he crawled through dirty puddles, his legs soaked from the knee down and his hands were getting cold. How much further? Sir Eric asked. Fortunately, they weren't far away. Soon the water went away and the ratcatcher stopped to fiddle with something above him. His nimble fingers felt along the wooden planks, and with a few twists, he pushed them up, revealing a narrow way to climb out. Once the board was removed, the ratcatcher sat staring upwards, his eyes dilating. Pale-faced, he shuffled aside without a word. Sir Eric crawled over to go next, but like the ratcatcher, he too seemed to be wary of something up there. Wondering what caused him to react, Emmett was the last to climb up and out underneath the dining table in Hariel's chamber. Except it now looked nothing like it should. Confused, Emmett crawled out from underneath the table and stood slowly. Initially, he was convinced the ratcatcher had taken a wrong turn. Surely this was outside. Except it was such a magical place. Emmett knew it couldn't be anywhere but wherever Hariel was. The four walls of the chamber were drastically different. One was filled with rich greenery with white flowers, and looked more akin to the entrance to a forest than a wall. The facade out towards the courtyard had its windows expanded, blown so out of proportion it stretched across the whole wall. The third wall normally had a finely woven rug draped across it, one that depicted a raging sea battle with Valarian ships and soldiers holding steel, while a big black dragon with a Targaryen rider flew overhead as the troops clashed against the Bravosi opposition from an age-long past. But the last Emmett laid eyes on that carpet, it had not been moving. One of the woven Valarians on the carpet threw his spear, and Emmett watched it fly across the canvas and hit the neck of a Bravosi soldier. The Bravosi stumbled back and fell into the ocean, where he waved around, struggling to swim. The black dragon let out a burst of fire, setting the sails on fire while dodging ineffective arrows. Then it swooped down, landing on one of the ships and using its sheer weight, claws and teeth to sink it. It was like watching a mesmerizing puppet show. A skilled puppeteer could simultaneously control a few puppets, and the performances needed several people working different puppets if they tried depicting a greater scene. But Hariel's magic allowed for all the little pieces to move without a single string. Emmett knew Hariel could do something similar with her clothes. Everyone within the king's court knew. But he'd never seen her do it to art, to objects, to the building itself. Yet here she'd used the stately carpet as her base, enchanting it to new heights. She'd made the woven water move, the clouds drifted across the sunset sky, the ship swayed, the sails burned, the soldiers moved about, the dragon flew. It was alive. And that was before he got into what she'd done to everything else. Emmett angled his head back, staring up at where the ceiling had been replaced with a night sky. Bright stars twinkled from a deep dark space that seemed to reach into an infinity, where there should have been plain wooden beams and panels. The glass panes of the enlarged window were cut into a mosaic of colors in some abstract art that had made his Uncle Gawain want to paint it. Except he wouldn't be able to capture his character, because the glass kept changing colors. The floor felt solid under his feet, except it looked like he was standing on the surface of a water lily pond. When he peered down, his pale reflection looked back, the still water framing his face with the night sky around it. Standing along the last wall was some sort of magical object, and Emmett was irritated it took him so long to understand what it was. It was Hariel's bed. She'd enchanted it to look different, but the shape remained the same, even if nothing else was. The four posters on her bed looked like pools of water trickling upwards, like some confused water fountain sprayed that didn't quite understand the laws of nature, leaving the water trickling the wrong way. And when the four streams reached the canopy, the water spilled outwards to form the closed curtains. Whatever Hariel had been doing, be it the indoor rain cloud, the starry sky and everything else, surely this was one for the history books. A hush lay over the room as Eamon treaded forward with care. The water was so lifelike he feared any misstep would see him slipping through the floor and dunked into the water. Or would he perhaps fall through to the third floor below? His steps created ripples into the surface, but his footing remained solid, noiseless. Hadn't it been so nerve-wracking, it'd be amazing. Perhaps it was. Sir Eric stood frozen, clutching at the hilt of his sword, but too overwhelmed to move as he took in all the magics. The white of his eyes overwhelming his shrinking pupils, while only the top of the ratcatcher's curly hair remained visible by the passage. Eamon made it over to the enchanted bed and reached out with a slightly trembling hand for the watery curtains. He expected wetness, but no, His hand closed around dry, warm wool. Empowered by the understanding of what sort of magic this was, pretty yet harmless enchantments, Aemond pulled the curtain aside, making it look like it could bend water with the action. Aemond found his culprit within. Ariel lay curled on the bed, her black hair sprawled in a tangle over her pillow. With a tired moan, she turned over slowly. Aemond? What did you do in here? Aemond demanded. Why are you here? Are you not supposed to be in a sept for Maiden's Day? Dragging a hand over her face, she sat up, blinking repeatedly. It was like she hadn't registered half of what he said. The room. Aemond waved his hand to indicate the queerness around them. Oh. She sniffed and rubbed at her puffy eyes. I was trying some charms, and I lay down to rest. I didn't hear you come in. Ariel wasn't meeting his gaze, but even if she faced away from him, he took note of her swollen eyes, tight expression and a runny nose. Like she'd been crying, as if she was trying not to cry at that very moment. Oh no. Had she been in here crying? Aemond was not good with crying women. He wasn't good with crying children either. Weeping women and children made Aemond uncomfortable, while crying men made him angry. Crying in general was just not his thing. Who are you? Ariel asked, and Aemond followed her eyeline to where the ratcatcher peeked up from the hole in the floor. Once he realized Ariel was talking to him, the ratcatcher quickly dug down into the passage again. Ariel looked bewildered from Sir Eric to Aemond to the hole underneath the table, waking up enough to realize how queer this scene looked. Who was that? The ratcatcher who knew the secret passage into this chamber. There's a passage into my chamber? She looked him up and down, and reached out to dust off a smudge on his vest. Did you come through that hole, Aemond? I had to. Why didn't you answer me when I knocked? She frowned. I didn't hear anything. How could you not? Aemond looked around for the door, because he honestly had no idea where it had gone. As he searched, Aemond registered the silence of the room didn't feel natural. It was like someone had put a blanket over the whole room. He couldn't hear the castle in the slightest. Neither the wind outside, footsteps from above, nor anyone in the hallway. I was trying out some noise adjustment charms. I guess they worked. She considered it for a moment. As for the rest, I was just practicing. She twirled her finger in a circle, using the gesture to point out the whole room. You must undo it, Aemond said. Worn and pale, she felt around on the feather mattress after a wand until she found it rolled underneath the covers. Sniffling and with her head downcast, she got to her feet and set to work. Aemond stepped back to where Sir Eric watched Ariel walk around the room, her arm moving in slow, purposeful arches while murmuring under her breath something about finite. She's been crying, Aemond murmured. Sir Eric took a moment to respond, too distracted watching the wall that looked like the entrance to the King's Forest disappear before their eyes, revealing the door hidden behind it while the grove turned back into a garland. As if this was something entirely unremarkable, Ariel didn't give it a second glance before starting on the ceiling. I can see that. What do we do? We? Eric was turning slightly panicked. I hardly know her. Fine, what do I do? Ask her what's the matter? What if asking makes her start crying again? I don't know. Apologize? Aemond blinked. How come everyone overlooked the fact he was a prince today? Well, after a day of scrubbing chainmail and crawling through floors and walls, he likely didn't much look like one in that moment. But still, why would I do that? As a lad, when our mother got upset, it was usually because our father failed to apologize over something. Ariel had returned the ceiling to its normal, boring appearance, but Aemond couldn't help thinking it looked better before. She swished her wand again, turning the lily ponds back into drab timber floor. What are you whispering about? She wondered quietly, glancing briefly up from her work. Nothing, Eamon said quickly, casting an uncertain glance to Sir Eric. The knight was of no help, and gave only a short nod of encouragement. Apologize? Him? To her? What for? Eamon never did apologize for calling her a cunt at one time. But that was ancient history. He could apologize for the political plots that had been popping up like daisies in spring after Aegon's wedding, but she shouldn't know about them. Besides, there was no way in the Seven Hells he was bringing the matter up in front of Sir Eric and some ratcatcher lurking in the floor. Are you done? He asked instead. Perhaps if he ignored it, it'd go away on its own? Yes. Is the rain in the hallway gone as well? What rain? Eamon walked over to the door, but though it was now visible, it somehow remained locked. Wait a moment. Hale pointed her wand. Alohomora. He didn't know what the magic did, and when he turned the handle again, it could finally be opened. Peculiarly, it also made the noises of the castle come washing in. Literally. Water pressed against the other side of the door, something magical keeping it from slipping through the cracks until Eamon wrestled it open, and abruptly it was free to flood into the chamber. Bloody hell! As Hariel explained it, she hadn't been aware of the rain cloud in the hallway. Hariel insisted she'd been experimenting with magics privately in her chamber, and what had been happening in the hallway was sheer accidental. She had locked her door and muffled the noise around the castle because she didn't want anyone to walk in while she was doing magic. She wanted privacy, and had therefore not known her magics had leaked beyond the confines of her chamber. It could have developed into a bigger issue, at least if Hariel hadn't made such short work of the cleanup. With a few waves of the arm, the rain stopped, the water went away, the buckets floated up into neat stacks, and everything was dried. It was like nothing had happened. Yet something clearly had, and Eamon couldn't figure out what. Hariel had locked herself in her room and missed the afternoon sermon in the sept. As she walked back into her chamber, she didn't look to have any plans to show for the evening sermon either. Are you ill? Is that why you spent the noon in here spellcasting? Eamon wondered. Should I call for the maester? I don't need the maester. They say you missed the noon sermon. The Septa won't be pleased. I'm not up for it. I don't want to be with the other girls. Hariel explained absently, bending down to sit on her knees, her white gown spilling out around her feet while she examined the entrance to the secret passage. Why didn't she want to be with the other girls? And why was Hariel acting so strangely blasé about it? She didn't seem to care about the mess she'd made, the inconvenience it had been to Eamon, nor that she had missed out on the Maiden's Day traditions. Or maybe blasé was the wrong word. Hariel seemed too preoccupied with her own thoughts, some sort of distraction, to have the energy to care for much else. Hello there. Hearing Hariel's dubious greeting made a puzzled Eamon look over. Who are you talking to? Are you the ratcatcher who got into my chamber? Hariel asked, and a hushed voice answered her from the darkness. Aye, milady. Why was he still here? You can leave now, ratcatcher. The man didn't heed the order though. Instead his shaggy head peeked up from between the floorboards. My prince, I beg your pardon, but you promised... The man was speaking very fast, as if he hoped speed would make it sound better. If I could get you into this chamber, I would get a silver moon. Oh. Eamon almost smacked his forehead. In the face of all the magic, the promise of her payment had slipped his mind. Annoyed, Eamon pulled out his coin purse, but there were only a handful of coppers and a couple golden dragons within. No silver. The ratcatcher hadn't worked anywhere near hard enough to deserve a golden dragon. That was probably more than the likes of him earned in a whole year. Eamon guessed he could send for someone to get a silver stack to pay the man, but he wanted him gone. Yet he'd made a promise, a public one, and Hariel was right there. Making a snap decision, Eamon figured he'd look better as a generous prince than a stingy coin counter, so he threw a gold dragon into the hole. Eamon heard the coin hit the passage floor and roll, and the ratcatcher scurried after it. That's for showing the way, and because I expect your discretion regarding this incident. The ratcatcher left the way he'd come, through the dark tunnel until he was both out of sight and out of hearing, and Harry looked at him strangely. He knew how to get in here, whilst you did not, she clarified. The ratcatchers chase rodents through the walls all day, every day, so yes, they do stumble upon more of these passages than those of us who are free to take the main staircases do. I don't like that anyone can burst into my chamber whilst I'm asleep, she said. There wasn't any visible tears, but it's not like he couldn't see her swollen eyes, red nose, and the tear tracks on the side of her face. It's safe, Eamon promised, uneasy with her sorrow, but simultaneously aware it could be worse. At least she wasn't openly weeping. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looked like 3 men broke through my locking spells and got into my chamber whilst I was asleep this afternoon. Alright, when phrased like that, it didn't sound too good. Eamon pursed his lips. Because it was on my orders. This is my home. This is the king's castle. It did nothing to reassure his betrothed. That made no difference when they came for Fang. Eamon blinked, momentarily floundering. The passage into this room isn't well known. I didn't know of it, and neither did my valet nor Sir Eric. We had to get someone to locate it. And now that you're aware of it, you could simply put something heavy over the entrance. And regarding Fang, I talked with the captain of the city watch, Eamon said, hoping to gain a more earnest reaction than short grunts and distracted answers. You did? Mentally, Eamon patted himself on the back for the excellent pick of distraction. It had worked. Somewhat. Eamon told Harriel everything he knew, and might even have embezzled a bit. Regardless, when Romeo once more reminded Harriel she was expected in the King's Solar to enchant his model of old Valyria, the unease in his stomach still hadn't eased up when they parted ways. Surely Harriel missed Fang, but Eamon didn't expect it to find her crying about it. He didn't care for it. Crying women was always a source of irritation, and it left Eamon feeling uncomfortably useless. Eamon told her the ones who heard Fang were captured and being punished. Justice was being served and Fang was being avenged. Yet even after he fixed her problems, Harriel didn't seem that enthused. All she wanted to know was, why? Why had they done it? Which was the one thing that wasn't quite answered yet, and this one missing factor somehow made the rest of Eamon's progress seem lacking. Eamon couldn't see why the question of why was so important to her. Certainly it had been neat for the sake of the Red Keep security to learn who had lent them aid, because they couldn't have accomplished this alone. 4 ex-prisoners living in King's Landing did not have open access to the black cells. Someone had let them in and out. Eamon would bet his fastest horse on an inexplicably missing guard. Likely he'd been the one to smuggle the men in and out of the black cells. But then who had seen fit to get rid of the guard after the ploy was discovered? These were significant questions which concerned the security of the Red Keep. Why did it seem to concern Harriel so much more? Wasn't the important part that the men who'd kept Fang's teeth and committed illegal atrocities were captured? That Eamon had imprisoned them where they could never hurt her or her loved ones again? Harriel was so upset she shut herself in a room crying. So how come Eamon's update counted for so little she didn't even seem relieved? Shouldn't that have been enough to cheer her up? Instead she kept asking about why. What more did she want from him? Eamon had fixed it, yet she remained sad. Eamon exhaled heavily. What is it, Prince Eamon? Sir Eric asked as they walked back towards his chamber. Is it the magic? Sir Eric guessed with compassion. That was quite troubling. Eamon scowled. The magic? Not at all. Personally, he would sooner call it wondrous than troubling. There would always be the weak-willed and the craven, fearing a power they themselves could never have. But Eamon wasn't afraid. It had actually felt wrong to make Harriel remove her magical improvements. When they eventually married and moved to the point of Cracklaw, Harriel should cast such spells in every room. It almost didn't matter what size their castle ended up being. With such interior, their stronghold would become the envy of the kingdom. Perhaps some cowardly lords would stay clear out of superstitious fear of bewitchment, but if anything, that thought only amused Aemond. It'd be an effective method to sort out the dutiful lords from those too delicate to bother with. It's only... In truth, this issue was not entirely new. Be it his mother, his sister, or his betrothed, he had seen him upset and hurt uncountable times before. The few instances where he was given an insight into their troubles, they bemoaned about how the men in their lives didn't understand them. Yet whenever Aemond helped, he apparently did it wrong. Frankly, it never failed to confuse him. From what Aemond could tell, he was usually quick to solve their issues, be it covering up Igolsey the Scrub for his mother's sake, or to tell some insolent knight to shut up about Helena's unusual insect interests if he wanted to keep his tongue, or how he had 4 men imprisoned for Heriel's sake. He fixed their issues, and so the logical outcome would be for the tears to stop, and they should be happy again. But for some unfathomable reason, that was never how it turned out. Aemond couldn't figure out how to express this juxtaposition succinctly enough that a Kingsguard would get the crux of the issue either. A man sworn to celibacy for the remains of his life, one who'd forsaken family, lands, and titles to serve his king. In the end, there was only one thing Aemond could say. Women confound me.